The wind howled across the barren plains of Colorado Territory, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of a harsh winter to come. Morgan Yates pulled his hat lower, squinting against the dust as he guided his stallion along the rugged trail. October 1871 had been unforgiving, and as the first snowflakes began to drift down from the darkening sky, he knew he needed shelter soon. Morgan had been riding for 3 days straight, leaving behind the bloodshed at Willow Creek. The wanted poster with his face on it told only half the truth. Yes, he'd killed 3 men, but they'd murdered his partner in cold blood after a poker game gone wrong. Justice served, some might say, but the law didn't see it that way. The dilapidated cabin appeared like a mirage through the thickening snow. It stood alone in a small clearing, smoke curling faintly from its chimney. Morgan approached cautiously, one hand resting on his Colt. Years in the West had taught him that unexpected hospitality often came with unexpected dangers. He dismounted, his boots crunching in the fresh powder as he approached. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and the windows were covered with what appeared to be old feed sacks. Morgan knocked, hearing nothing but the wind in response. He pushed the door open slowly, the creak echoing in the stillness. "Hello," he called, stepping into the dim interior. "Anyone here?" A shuffle from the corner caught his attention, and Morgan's hand tightened on his pistol. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he made out a figure huddled by a dying fire, wrapped in tattered blankets. "Don't come any closer," a woman's voice warned, trembling but determined. She pointed an ancient shotgun at him, her hands shaking visibly. Morgan raised his hand slowly. "Madam, I mean no harm, just looking for shelter from the storm." The woman emerged slightly from her nest of blankets, and Morgan felt his breath catch. Despite the dirt on her face and the hollow cheeks of someone who hadn't eaten properly in weeks, she was beautiful, dark hair falling in tangled waves around her shoulders, eyes the color of summer sage. But what struck him most was the unmistakable swell of her belly beneath the threadbare dress she wore. "You're alone?" she asked, not lowering the shotgun. "Yes, madam, just me and my horse outside." A sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin's walls, sending a shower of snow through a gap in the roof. The woman shivered violently, and Morgan could see her struggle to maintain her grip on the weapon. "Fire's almost out," he observed casually. "I've got supplies. Food, too." The mention of food made her eyes widen momentarily before narrowing with suspicion. "What do you want in return?" Morgan shook his head. "Nothing, madam, just a roof for the night." The woman's stomach growled audibly in the silence that followed, and Morgan saw a flash of embarrassment cross her face. Slowly, she lowered the shotgun, seemingly too exhausted to maintain her defensive posture. "You can stay," she said finally, "but I'll be keeping this close." She patted the shotgun that now rested across her lap. Morgan nodded, then stepped back outside to retrieve his saddlebags and see to his horse. When he returned, the woman had moved closer to the dwindling fire, her hands outstretched toward the meager warmth. Up close, he could see just how thin she was despite her pregnant condition, her collarbones jutting sharply beneath her dress. Without a word, Morgan set about building up the fire, adding logs from a small stack beside the hearth. Then he opened his saddlebag and pulled out jerky, hardtack, and a small jar of preserves, luxuries in the wilderness. The woman watched him with wary eyes as he arranged the food on a clean bandana and offered it to her. She hesitated, pride battling hunger on her face. "Go on," Morgan said softly. "From now on, you both eat before I do." Her eyes widened at his words, and for a moment, Morgan thought she might cry. Instead, she took the food with trembling hands and began to eat slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be her last. "Thank you," she whispered eventually. "I'm Temperance." "Temperance Ellis, Morgan Yates," he replied, carefully feeding the fire. "How long have you been out here alone, Miss Ellis?" Temperance's hand moved protectively to her swollen belly. "3 months, since Thomas died." Morgan didn't press for details, but Temperance continued after a moment, her voice distant. "He was my husband. Fever took him right after we settled here. We were heading to Denver, but—" Her voice trailed off. The storm intensified outside, wind howling through the gaps in the cabin walls. Morgan rose and began patching the worst holes with spare blankets from his pack. "Baby's due in about a month, I reckon," Temperance said, watching him work. "I was trying to get strong enough to make it to town, but—" She gestured at her meager surroundings. Morgan nodded, understanding the impossibility of her situation. A pregnant woman alone, miles from civilization, with winter setting in. It was a death sentence for her and the child. "There's a settlement called Timberline about 2 days' ride from here," he said, securing the last blanket. "I was planning to head there tomorrow." Temperance's eyes met his, a flicker of hope quickly extinguished. "I can barely walk to the stream for water. I certainly can't ride for 2 days." Morgan considered their options as he prepared a simple stew with dried meat and the few potatoes he'd been saving. The smell filled the small cabin, and he noticed Temperance watching the pot with undisguised longing. "We'll stay until you're stronger," he decided, filling a tin cup with stew and passing it to her. "I've got supplies enough for a week or so, then we'll figure something out." Temperance accepted the food gratefully, but her expression remained troubled. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Morgan was quiet for a long moment, stirring the remaining stew. The firelight cast shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the scar that ran along his jawline. "My sister was in a similar situation once," he finally said. "No one helped her." He didn't elaborate, and Temperance didn't ask. Some pain was too private to share with strangers. That night, Morgan slept on the floor near the door, his saddle as a pillow and his coat as a blanket. Temperance took the cabin's only bed little more than a straw mattress on a crude wooden frame. Despite her initial suspicion, exhaustion soon claimed her, and her soft, regular breathing filled the cabin. Morgan lay awake longer, listening to the storm and contemplating the turn his journey had taken. He'd been running from his past, only to stumble into someone else's desperate present. The irony wasn't lost on him. Morning brought clear skies and a world transformed by snow. Morgan rose early, building up the fire before heading outside to check his horse and hunt for fresh game. Temperance was still sleeping when he left, the food and warmth having done what weeks of deprivation had prevented. He returned midday with 2 rabbits, surprised to find Temperance awake and attempting to sweep the cabin floor with a makeshift broom of bound twigs. She looked slightly better in the daylight. Some color had returned to her cheeks, though she still moved with the careful slowness of someone conserving precious energy. "You shouldn't be exerting yourself," Morgan said, setting down his catch. Temperance paused, leaning on her broom. "I've been lying down for days. It feels good to move a little." She eyed the rabbits. "You're a good hunter." Morgan shrugged off the compliment and set about preparing the rabbits, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Temperance watched him work, occasionally asking questions about his life before finding her cabin. He answered sparingly, revealing little beyond his plan to reach Timberline and maybe find work for the winter. As days passed, a routine developed between them. Morgan hunted or trapped game, maintained the cabin, and chopped firewood. Temperance, gradually regaining her strength, cooked what meals she could with their limited supplies and mended Morgan's torn clothing with needle and thread found in her late husband's belongings. A week into their arrangement, Morgan noticed Temperance struggling to reach her feet, her hands pressed against her lower back. "Pain bad today?" he asked, setting down an armful of firewood. Temperance nodded, her face drawn. "The baby's been active. Feels like he's trying to kick his way out sometimes." Morgan raised an eyebrow. A small smile crossed Temperance's face, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Just a feeling. Thomas was so sure it would be a boy. The mention of her husband brought a familiar shadow to her eyes. Morgan had noticed she rarely spoke of him, though his presence lingered in the cabin, his tools hanging on the wall, his boots by the door. "What was he like?" Morgan asked, surprising himself with the question. He wasn't typically one to pry. Temperance eased herself onto the cabin's single chair, her hands resting on her rounded belly. "Kind. A dreamer. He had plans for us in Denver, was going to open a carpentry shop." She glanced around the crude cabin. "He built this place in 2 weeks when I got too tired to travel further. Said it was temporary." Her voice cracked slightly. "Turns out it was, just not the way he meant." Morgan nodded, understanding all too well how quickly fate could change course. "The snow's letting up. If you're feeling stronger, we should consider heading to Timberline soon." "That baby won't wait for spring." Fear flashed across Temperance's face, quickly masked. "I've never had a child before. I don't know the first thing about birthing." "There'll be women in Timberline who do," Morgan assured her, though in truth, he shared her concern. The wilderness was no place for such things. That evening, as they shared a meal of roasted grouse and the last of Morgan's coffee, Temperance asked the question that had clearly been troubling her. "What happens when we reach Timberline? Will you just leave me there?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. Morgan had been wondering the same thing himself. His original plan had been to lie low in Timberline until spring, then continue west to California, where no one knew his face or his past. A pregnant widow complicated matters considerably. "I won't abandon you," he said finally. "I'll make sure you're situated somewhere safe before I move on." Temperance nodded, though he could tell his answer hadn't entirely satisfied her. The truth was, it hadn't satisfied him either. In just a week, he'd grown accustomed to her presence, to her quiet strength and occasional dry humor. The thought of continuing his solitary journey felt strangely hollow. The next morning, Morgan woke to find Temperance already up, packing what few belongings she could carry. "You're sure about this?" he asked, watching her fold a small quilt likely intended for the baby. "No," she admitted with a small smile, "but staying here alone is certain death for both of us. At least Timberline offers a chance." Morgan had spent the previous day constructing a makeshift travois that could be attached to his horse. It wasn't elegant, but it would allow Temperance to rest when riding became too difficult. He'd also fashioned a covering from oilcloth to protect her from the elements. They set out at midday, the winter sun casting long shadows across the pristine snow. Temperance sat behind Morgan on his horse, her arms wrapped tentatively around his waist. She'd been apprehensive about riding at first, worried about harming the baby, but the alternative of walking through knee-deep snow was impossible in her condition. "It's beautiful," she murmured as they crested a hill, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape stretching to distant mountains. "I'd almost forgotten what the world looked like beyond the cabin." Morgan felt a tightness in his chest at the wonder in her voice. He'd been traversing the West for years, and had grown somewhat immune to its grandeur. Seeing it through Temperance's eyes renewed his appreciation for the wild beauty surrounding them. They made slower progress than Morgan had hoped, forced to stop frequently for Temperance to stretch her legs and ease the discomfort of riding. By nightfall, they'd covered perhaps half the distance he might have managed alone. Morgan made camp in a sheltered grove of pines, building a lean-to against a rock face to block the wind. Temperance sat wrapped in blankets, watching him work with a mixture of admiration and guilt. "I'm slowing you down," she said as he prepared a small fire. Morgan shook his head. "We're making good time considering. Another day should see us to Timberline." Temperance didn't look convinced. "You didn't sign on to be responsible for a woman in my condition. I know that." Morgan paused in his work, meeting her gaze across the small fire. "Miss Ellis, Temperance," she corrected gently. "After all this, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Temperance," he amended. "I'm exactly where I choose to be." Something passed between them, then an understanding that transcended words. Temperance nodded slightly, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. The night was cold but still, the silence broken only by the occasional call of a distant wolf. Morgan took first watch, sitting with his back against a tree, rifle across his knees. He found his gaze returning to Temperance as she slept, her face peaceful in repose, one hand protectively cradling her belly even in sleep. It was near dawn when Temperance woke with a startled gasp. Sitting up abruptly, Morgan was at her side instantly. "What is it?" "Pain," she managed, her face contorted. "Sharp pain, different from before." Alarm coursed through Morgan. "The baby, is it coming?" Temperance shook her head, though uncertainty clouded her eyes. "It's too early, I think it's just from the riding yesterday." Morgan wasn't convinced, but there was little to be done either way. "We need to reach Timberline today," he said grimly. "Can you ride?" Temperance nodded, her determination evident despite her discomfort. "I can ride." They broke camp quickly, Morgan helping Temperance onto the horse before mounting behind her this time, allowing her to lean back against his chest for support. The position was less comfortable for him, but safer for her. The day that followed was grueling. Temperance's pains came intermittently, causing her to tense and grip Morgan's arm with surprising strength. They stopped more frequently, but each time Temperance insisted on continuing, her jaw set with stubborn resolve. The sun was low in the western sky when Morgan spotted smoke rising from chimneys in the distance. Timberline appeared as a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, surrounded by the pine forests that gave the settlement its name. "We made it," he murmured to Temperance, who had been drifting in and out of consciousness for the past hour. She stirred against him, raising her head weakly. "Thank God," she whispered. Their arrival in Timberline drew immediate attention. It wasn't often that strangers appeared during winter, especially not a hard-looking man carrying a clearly pregnant and distressed woman. Morgan rode directly to what appeared to be the town's main establishment, a combination saloon and hotel called the Ponderosa. He dismounted carefully, then lifted Temperance down, alarmed at how light she felt despite her pregnancy. "Need help here?" he called as he carried her through the saloon doors. The piano player stopped mid-song, and conversation died as all eyes turned toward them. A heavy-set woman with graying hair emerged from behind the bar, taking in the situation with a practiced eye. "Bring her upstairs," she commanded, already moving toward a staircase at the back. "Millie, fetch Doc Hanson. Tell him it's urgent." Morgan followed the woman to a small but clean room on the second floor, laying Temperance carefully on the bed. She was fully conscious now, her face pale with pain and exhaustion. "I'm Martha Wilkins," the older woman said briskly, rolling up her sleeves. "I own this establishment, and you two are Morgan Yates. This is Temperance Ellis. She's widowed, about 8 months along. We've traveled from a cabin 2 days east of here." Martha's eyebrows rose at this information, but she asked no further questions, focusing instead on making Temperance comfortable. She sent a young girl running for hot water and clean linens, then shooed Morgan from the room. "Wait downstairs," she instructed. "Doc will want to examine her without you hovering." Morgan hesitated, surprisingly reluctant to leave Temperance's side. "Go," Temperance said softly, reaching out to briefly squeeze his hand. "I'll be all right now, thanks to you." The simple gesture affected Morgan more than he cared to admit. He nodded once, then retreated downstairs to the saloon where curious patrons watched him with undisguised interest. The hours that followed were among the longest of Morgan's life. He sat at a corner table, nursing a whiskey and deflecting questions from the locals with terse responses. When the doctor finally appeared, a bald man with spectacles and a perpetually worried expression, Morgan jumped to his feet. "She's in labor," the doctor confirmed. "Early but not dangerously so. The journey likely triggered it." Relief washed through Morgan, followed immediately by a new concern. "Will she be all right? And the baby?" The doctor removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. "Mrs. Wilkins is with her, and she's helped birth half the children in this county. If anyone can see them through safely, it's her." He studied Morgan curiously. "You're not the father, I take it?" "No," Morgan answered shortly. "Her husband died months ago. I found her alone in that cabin." Understanding dawned in the doctor's eyes. "Well, Mr. Yates, it seems Timberline owes you a debt of gratitude. That young woman and her child would certainly have perished without your intervention." Morgan waved away the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." The doctor's skeptical expression suggested he knew better, but he didn't argue. "It may be a long night. I'd suggest getting some rest yourself. Mrs. Wilkins will send word when there's news." But Morgan couldn't rest. He paced the saloon until the other patrons began to give him a wide berth, then moved outside to tend to his horse and bring in Temperance's meager belongings. The night air was crisp and clear, stars blazing in the black velvet sky. He found himself staring up at them, offering silent prayers to a God he wasn't sure he still believed in. It was past midnight when he heard a baby's cry pierce the night. Morgan was halfway up the stairs before he realized he was moving. He stopped outside the door to Temperance's room, suddenly uncertain of his place in this tableau. The door opened, and Martha Wilkins emerged, her apron stained but her face wreathed in a tired smile. "A healthy boy," she announced. "Small but strong, lunged as you can hear." The relief that flooded through Morgan was so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. "And Temperance, exhausted but doing well. She's asking for you." Morgan entered the room hesitantly. Temperance lay propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat but her face radiant as she gazed down at the tiny bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as Morgan approached, and the smile she gave him stole his breath. "Meet Thomas Morgan Ellis," she said softly. "Named for his father and the man who saved his life." Morgan stared at the infant, red-faced, wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair, and felt something shift irrevocably within him. He'd never considered himself a man destined for family life. His existence had been one of solitude and survival, punctuated by brief connections that inevitably ended in departure. Yet standing there, looking at Temperance and her newborn son, he felt a sense of rightness he'd never experienced before. "He's perfect," Morgan said, his voice rough with emotion. Temperance's eyes filled with tears. "We wouldn't be here without you. Both of us would have died in that cabin." Morgan shook his head. "You're stronger than you know, Temperance Ellis." She reached out, taking his calloused hand in her smaller one. "Stay," she whispered, "at least until spring." The simple request contained worlds of meaning. Morgan knew he should refuse. He had enemies. His past followed him like a shadow. Entangling himself with Temperance and her child would only put them at risk, and yet, "I'll stay," he found himself saying, squeezing her hand gently. "At least until spring." The smile that illuminated her face chased away the last of his doubts. In the days that followed, Morgan secured a small cabin on the outskirts of Timberline. It had belonged to a trapper who'd headed north and never returned, and the town council was happy to rent it to Morgan for a modest sum. He spent his evenings repairing its deficiencies, fixing the leaky roof, reinforcing the walls against the winter winds, building a proper cradle for little Thomas. Temperance and the baby remained at the Ponderosa for 2 weeks under Martha Wilkins' watchful eye. The older woman had taken an immediate liking to Temperance and appointed herself guardian of both mother and child. When Morgan finally brought them to the cabin, Martha accompanied them. Arms laden with necessities she insisted were just gathering dust anyway: extra blankets, cooking pots, baby clothes knitted by her own hands. "You'll need help with the little one," she told Temperance, casting a meaningful glance at Morgan. "Men are useless with babies, even the good ones." Temperance laughed, the sound warming the cabin more effectively than the crackling fire. "Morgan has surprised me at every turn. I imagine he'll surprise us both with this as well." Indeed, Morgan approached fatherhood, for that was essentially the role he'd assumed, though neither he nor Temperance had put a name to their arrangement, with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He learned to change the baby's wrappings, to rock him when he fussed, to recognize the different cries that signaled hunger, discomfort, or simple demand for attention. Winter settled around Timberline like a thick blanket, bringing snowstorms that sometimes lasted for days. Morgan found work at the livery stable, caring for the horses of travelers stranded by the weather and repairing tack and equipment. The pay was modest but steady, enough to keep food on the table and coal in the stove. Temperance, once fully recovered from childbirth, began taking in mending and sewing from townsfolk. Her skilled needlework quickly gained a reputation, and soon she had more work than she could handle alongside caring for little Thomas. The cabin, once sparse and utilitarian, gradually transformed into a home. Temperance hung simple curtains at the windows, placed wildflowers, dried now for winter, in a jar on the table, arranged their few possessions with an eye for comfort as well as practicality. Morgan would return from work to find the cabin warm and welcoming, Temperance humming softly as she worked, baby Thomas sleeping or watching the world with solemn dark eyes that reminded Morgan so much of his mother. It was domestic, ordinary, everything Morgan had never thought he wanted or deserved. The weeks passed, Christmas came and went with simple gifts and a special meal, and January brought the coldest temperatures anyone in Timberline could remember. Morgan would wake before dawn to break ice in the water barrel and stoke the fire, ensuring the cabin was warm before Temperance and Thomas rose for the day. One such morning, as he returned from chopping more firewood, he found Temperance standing at the stove, frying bacon for their breakfast. Little Thomas lay bundled in his cradle nearby, cooing softly at the mobile Morgan had carved for him, wooden stars and moons that danced in the heat rising from the stove. "You're up early," Morgan observed, setting the wood by the hearth. Temperance turned, her smile brightening the dim cabin. "Thomas was hungry, and I thought you might appreciate a hot breakfast before heading to the livery." Morgan watched her move about the small space, graceful despite the cramped quarters. Her hair was plaited in a simple braid, and she wore one of the dresses Martha had given her, blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. In the months since he'd found her half-starved in that dilapidated cabin, she'd blossomed into the woman she was meant to be: strong, vibrant, determined. "What?" she asked, noticing his stare. Morgan shook his head, unable to articulate the swell of emotion in his chest. "Nothing, just glad to be here." Something in his tone made her pause. She set down the spatula and approached him, studying his face with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed walls. "Are you," she asked softly, "truly glad?" Morgan met her gaze steadily. "More than I ever expected to be." The admission hung between them, weighted with all the things they hadn't said over the past months. They'd lived together, raised Thomas together, shared meals and work and quiet evenings by the fire, yet they'd maintained a careful distance, neither willing to define what they were becoming to each other. Temperance reached up, her fingers brushing lightly against his jaw. "I've never properly thanked you," she whispered, "for everything." Morgan caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. "You don't owe me thanks, Temperance." "Not gratitude," she corrected, moving closer. "This isn't about debt." And then she was rising on tiptoe, pressing her lips to his in a kiss so gentle it nearly undid him. Morgan stood frozen for a moment, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had fallen over them. Then slowly, he wrapped his arms around her waist, drawing her closer as he returned the kiss with all the longing he'd been suppressing for months. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Temperance's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. "I've wanted to do that for a very long time," she confessed. Morgan tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, marveling at the softness of her skin. "Why didn't you?" "I wasn't sure." She hesitated. "You've never spoken of staying beyond spring." "I didn't want to complicate things if you meant to leave." The words were a stark reminder of the reality they faced. Spring was approaching, and with it, the end of the arrangement they'd agreed upon months ago in that room above the saloon. "What if I didn't leave?" Morgan asked, the question emerging before he could consider its implications. Hope flared in Temperance's eyes, quickly tempered by caution. "Is that what you want?" Morgan looked around the small cabin at the home they'd created, at little Thomas watching them with curious eyes, at Temperance herself, waiting for his answer with her heart in her gaze. "I've been running for a long time," he said slowly. "From my past, from connections, from putting down roots anywhere. It seemed safer that way." He took a deep breath. "But these past months with you and Thomas, it's the first time I've felt like I belonged somewhere, like I had a purpose beyond just surviving." Temperance's smile was tremulous. "We could build a life here, a real one." The bacon began to smoke on the stove, and Temperance hurried to save their breakfast, breaking the moment. But something had changed between them, a boundary crossed that could not be uncrossed. That evening, after Thomas was asleep in his cradle, they sat before the fire, closer than they would have dared before. Temperance leaned against Morgan's shoulder as he told her, at last, the full story of his past, the partner betrayed and murdered, his own violent retribution, the warrant for his arrest that had sent him fleeing eastward. "If they find me," he finished, staring into the flames, "I'll hang." That's the truth of it. Temperance was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words. Then she took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Do you regret what you did?" Morgan considered the question carefully. "I regret the necessity of it." "But those men killed Jacob in cold blood, laughing as they did it. They would have killed others. So no, I don't regret stopping them." Temperance nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Then we'll be careful. Timberline is remote enough that news travels slowly. And people here have come to respect you. That counts for something." Her easy acceptance of his past, of the risk his presence might bring to her and Thomas, humbled Morgan. He drew her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You're remarkable, Temperance Ellis." She turned in his arms, her expression suddenly serious. "I love you, Morgan Yates. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you said those words in my cabin. From now on, you both eat before I do. No one had ever put me first like that." The declaration stunned Morgan into silence. He'd known, on some level, that what had grown between them was love, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that both terrified and exhilarated him. "You don't have to say it back," Temperance added quickly, misinterpreting his silence. "I just wanted you to know." Morgan cupped her face in his hands, making sure she met his gaze. "I love you too," he said, the words emerging rough but sincere. "More than I thought possible. You and Thomas. You're my home now." The kiss that followed sealed a promise between them to face whatever came together, to build the life they both desired despite the shadows of the past. As winter gave way to spring, Morgan and Temperance settled into their new understanding. They didn't speak of marriage, yet Temperance was still legally Thomas's widow, and Morgan's uncertain legal status complicated matters, but in every way that mattered, they were a family. Little Thomas thrived, growing stronger each day. He had his mother's eyes, and Morgan liked to think, something of his own determination. The first time the baby reached for him, tiny fingers grasping at Morgan's beard with a delighted gurgle, Morgan felt a love so fierce it almost frightened him. April brought the first true thaw, snowmelt creating rivulets that carved paths through the muddy streets of Timberline. With the improved weather came travelers, traders heading west, miners seeking their fortunes in the mountains, families looking for fresh starts. Morgan watched them warily, always alert for unfamiliar faces that might spell danger. But as weeks passed without incident, he began to relax, to believe that perhaps they truly could build a life here undisturbed. Then, on a bright May morning, a stranger rode into town. Morgan was at the livery when the man arrived, tall, well-dressed, with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The silver star pinned to his vest identified him as a marshal, and Morgan felt his blood run cold. He remained in the shadows of the stable, watching as the marshal dismounted outside the sheriff's office. Timberline's sheriff, a good-natured man named Bill Hollister, greeted the newcomer with a handshake and ushered him inside. Morgan's first instinct was to run to grab Temperance and Thomas and flee before the marshal could learn of his presence. But running would mean abandoning the life they'd built, returning to the precarious existence that had nearly cost Temperance and her unborn child their lives once before. He thought of Thomas, now beginning to sit up on his own, of Temperance's plans for a garden behind their cabin, of the future they'd begun to envision together. Running would mean surrendering all of it. With a resolve born of love rather than fear, Morgan finished his work at the livery, then headed directly to the sheriff's office. If there was any chance of preserving what they had built, it would begin with the truth. Sheriff Hollister looked up in surprise as Morgan entered, his expression shifting to alarm as he glanced between Morgan and the marshal seated across his desk. "Morgan," he began, rising from his chair. "This is Marshal James Cooper from Denver." I know why he's here," Morgan interrupted, meeting the marshal's evaluating stare. "He's here for me." The marshal stood slowly, one hand moving reflexively toward his sidearm. "And you are Morgan Yates," he replied steadily. "Wanted for the killings at Willow Creek last October." Recognition flashed in the marshal's eyes, followed by wariness. "You're surrendering?" "No," Morgan said. "I'm here to tell my side of what happened." What followed was the most important conversation of Morgan's life. He recounted the events at Willow Creek in detail: the poker game, the accusation of cheating that had been merely a pretext, the brutal murder of his partner Jacob, and yes, his own retribution against the men responsible. "I tracked them for 2 days," Morgan concluded. "They were drunk, celebrating their victory as they called it. I confronted them, gave them a chance to surrender, to face justice for what they'd done to Jacob. They drew on me instead." He met the marshal's gaze unflinchingly. "I defended myself." Marshal Cooper studied him thoughtfully. "That's not the story that reached Denver." "I imagine it wouldn't be," Morgan agreed. "The only witnesses were friends of theirs, and the dead don't testify." Sheriff Hollister cleared his throat. "Marshal, I've known Morgan Yates for 6 months now. He's been nothing but an asset to this community. Hardworking, honest. He saved a young widow and her unborn child from certain death this winter. That counts for something in my book." The marshal's expression remained unreadable. "The law doesn't concern itself with what a man does after a crime, only with the crime itself." Morgan felt hope slipping away. He thought of Temperance waiting at home, unaware that their world was about to collapse. "Then arrest me," he said quietly. "But give me time to say goodbye to my family first." Something in the marshal's expression changed at the word family. "You have children, Yates." "A son," Morgan replied. "Not by blood, but in every way that matters." The marshal was silent for a long moment, then reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded document. "I received this from the territorial governor 2 weeks ago. It seems new evidence came to light in the Willow Creek incident." Morgan stared at him, uncomprehending. "A man named Silas Jenkins was arrested for cattle rustling near Pueblo," the marshal explained. Facing the gallows, he decided to clear his conscience, gave a full confession about a lot of things, including what really happened at Willow Creek. He unfolded the document, revealing an official-looking paper with a seal. "He corroborated your version of events, stated that Jacob Brooks was murdered in cold blood, and that you acted in self-defense when confronting the men responsible." Morgan could scarcely believe what he was hearing. "So the warrant has been rescinded," the marshal confirmed, holding out the document. "You're a free man, Mr. Yates." Morgan took the paper with trembling hands, reading the words that granted him back his future. Relief washed through him so powerfully he had to grip the edge of the sheriff's desk to remain standing. "I still don't condone taking justice into your own hands," the marshal added, his tone stern but not unkind. "But it seems in this case, justice has found its way to the truth regardless." Morgan looked up from the document, meeting the marshal's gaze. "Thank you for bringing this to me yourself." The marshal nodded once, then gathered his hat from the desk. "I've done my duty. What you do with your second chance is up to you." Morgan left the sheriff's office in a daze, the pardon tucked safely in his shirt pocket. He walked through Timberline with new eyes, seeing not just a temporary haven but a place where he could truly belong, where he could build a life without looking over his shoulder. When he reached their cabin, he found Temperance in the small garden she'd started, little Thomas napping in a basket beside her as she worked the soil. She looked up at his approach, her smile fading as she took in his expression. "What's happened?" she asked, rising to her feet, soil-stained hands brushing at her apron. Morgan crossed to her in 3 strides, wrapped his arms around her and lifted her off her feet in an embrace that drew a startled laugh from her lips. "Morgan, what on earth?" He set her down gently, then pulled the pardon from his pocket, placing it in her hands. "Read it," he urged. Temperance unfolded the document, her eyes widening as she absorbed its contents. "A pardon?" she whispered, looking up at him in disbelief. "How?" Morgan explained what the marshal had told him, watching as joy bloomed across Temperance's face with each word. "You're free," she breathed when he finished. "Truly free." "We're free," he corrected, taking her hands in his, "to stay here to build the life we want. No more looking over my shoulder, no more preparing for the day we might have to run." Tears glistened in Temperance's eyes. "I can hardly believe it." Morgan reached into his pocket again, this time withdrawing a simple gold band. He'd purchased it weeks ago from a traveling peddler, carrying it with him daily while waiting for the courage or the right moment to offer it. "Marry me," he said simply, holding out the ring. "Be my wife in name as well as heart. Let me be a father to Thomas in truth, not just in practice." Temperance's answer was in her kiss, fierce and joyful, in the tears that dampened both their cheeks, in the way she held out her trembling hand for him to slip the ring onto her finger. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "1,000 times yes." They were married 2 weeks later in Timberline's small church, with baby Thomas in Martha Wilkins' arms and the entire town in attendance. Temperance wore a new dress of pale blue, silk, a gift from the women of Timberline, who had pooled their resources to purchase the fabric. Morgan, in a newly tailored suit, waited at the altar with Sheriff Hollister as his best man, scarcely able to believe the turn his life had taken. When Temperance walked down the aisle toward him, her eyes shining with love, Morgan knew with absolute certainty that all the hardships, all the years of solitude and struggle, had been leading him to this moment to her. "I, Morgan James Yates, take thee, Temperance Marie Ellis, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he vowed, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Temperance's voice trembled slightly as she repeated the words, her hand warm in his, the simple gold band gleaming in the sunlight streaming through the church's windows. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the pastor declared. "You may kiss your bride." The kiss they shared was a promise of the life they would build together, of the love that had found them against all odds, of a future brighter than either had dared to imagine. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and more food than Timberline had seen at one gathering in years. Little Thomas, passed from admiring arms to admiring arms, seemed to sense the significance of the day, bestowing smiles on everyone who held him. As twilight fell, Morgan found Temperance sitting on the porch of the Ponderosa, watching the festivities with contentment etched on her face. He sat beside her, taking her hand, his wife's hand, in his own. "Happy?" he asked softly. Temperance leaned against his shoulder, her answer a contented sigh. "More than I ever thought possible." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as lanterns were lit throughout the town, creating pools of golden light in the gathering dusk. "I've been thinking," Morgan said after a while, "about our future here." Temperance turned to look at him, curiosity in her gaze. "Timberline's growing, more families arriving every month, but there's no proper carpentry shop, no one building furniture or doing fine woodwork." He hesitated, then continued, "I was thinking I might start one. I learned the trade from my father, worked at it for years before everything changed." Temperance's eyes widened with understanding. "Thomas's dream, the carpentry shop he wanted to open in Denver." Morgan nodded. "I thought it fitting somehow. A way to honor his memory, to provide for the family he loved." Tears welled in Temperance's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "He would have liked that," she whispered. "And I think he would have liked you too, Morgan, would have been glad to know Thomas and I found someone like you." Morgan pressed a kiss to her forehead, humbled by her words. "I'll never replace him in your heart," he said. "Nor would I want to. But I promise to cherish the life we build together and to honor the memory of the man who loved you first." Temperance leaned up to kiss him properly, uncaring of the townsfolk who might see. "Our hearts have room for all our loves, past and present," she murmured. "Thomas will always be part of me, part of our son. But you, Morgan Yates, are my future." 5 years later, on a warm summer evening, Morgan sat on the porch of their home, a proper house now. built with his own hands on the edge of what had become a thriving San Andreas, Colorado. Beside him, Temperance rocked gently in her chair, humming a lullaby to the sleeping infant in her arms, their daughter, Rebecca, born just 3 months earlier. At the bottom of the porch steps, 6-year-old Thomas played with his wooden soldiers, occasionally glancing up to make sure his parents were watching his elaborate battle. The boy had grown sturdy and confident, with his mother's dark eyes and a serious demeanor that sometimes made Morgan think of the man whose name he carried. Morgan's carpentry business had flourished beyond his expectations. What had begun as a small workshop behind their cabin had expanded to a proper store on San Andreas Main Street, where he crafted furniture sought after throughout the territory for its beauty and craftsmanship. Temperance had found her own calling as well, establishing a small school for the town's growing population of children. Her intelligence and patience made her a beloved teacher, and she'd recently hired an assistant to help manage the classes while she focused on baby Rebecca. "Papa," Thomas called, interrupting Morgan's contemplation. "Watch this." Morgan leaned forward, smiling as his son demonstrated an impressive cavalry charge that sent enemy soldiers flying. "Well done, General Yates," he praised. "A decisive victory." Thomas beamed at the approval, then gathered his toys. "Can I go see if Mrs. Wilkins has any cookies? She said I could visit today." Morgan exchanged a glance with Temperance, who nodded her permission. "Be back before dark," she cautioned, "and thank her properly." They watched as Thomas raced down the path toward town, energy radiating from his small form. At 72, Martha Wilkins had slowed considerably, but remained a force in San Andreas, her affection for the Yates family unwavering over the years. "He grows more like you every day," Temperance observed, adjusting Rebecca's blanket. "So determined, so sure of himself," Morgan laughed. "He has your stubbornness, that's certain." Temperance arched an eyebrow at him. "I prefer to call it resoluteness of purpose." "As you wish, Mrs. Yates," Morgan conceded with a grin, reaching over to take her free hand in his. They sat together as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was a scene of such simple perfection that Morgan sometimes had to remind himself it was real, that this life, this family, was truly his. "You ever think about that day?" Temperance asked softly. "When you found me in that cabin?" Morgan squeezed her hand gently. "Often," he admitted. "How close I came to riding past. How different our lives would be if I had." Temperance's smile was reflective. "I was so afraid when I first saw you, this imposing figure with a gun at his hip. Then you said those words that changed everything. 'From now on, you both eat before I do,'" Morgan quoted, the memory clear as crystal despite the years that had passed. "You kept that promise," Temperance said, her voice full of love. "Every day since." Morgan looked at his wife, still beautiful to him, perhaps more so now with the confidence of a woman who knew herself, who had weathered hardship and emerged stronger, and at his infant daughter, sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. He thought of Thomas, growing into a fine boy who would someday become a good man, of the life they had built together, day by day, choice by choice. "Best decision I ever made," he said simply. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Morgan Yates counted his blessings: a family to love, a home to cherish, a future secured by trust and devotion. From the desperate meeting in a snowstorm to this peaceful evening, their journey had been one of healing and hope, of two broken people finding wholeness together. And as Temperance leaned over to rest her head against his shoulder, baby Rebecca sighing contentedly between them, Morgan knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, They would face them together just as they had since that fateful day, when a starving, pregnant woman and a lonely, haunted man had found in each other exactly what they needed to become whole.